There is no such thing as corrupt judges in professional boxing. Joe Rogan has it completely wrong. You don't need to be a corrupt judge. You only need to be a savvy judge. Let me explain this by asking you a couple of questions. So, question 1. If you're a professional boxing judge, who pays your nightly wages for working the fights? The correct answer is the promoter. Question 2. Who has the authority to veto a boxing judge even if they've been chosen by the boxing commission to work the fight? The answer is, again, the promoter. So, question 3. If you're a boxing judge, it's in your best interest to make sure you stay on the good side of the promoter. Okay, so how will you do that? Well, remember, the promoter has made a financial investment and is under contractual obligation to all the fighters in his stable. That means all the fighters he or she has under contract. The contracts usually specify that the promoter must offer that fighter a certain number of fights every year with a certain number of rounds at a certain minimum purse. And if the promoter fails to do so, then the fighter can say, that's a breach of contract. Contract's broken. I'm under no obligation to fight for this promoter anymore. So now that the promoter's made a financial investment in that fighter, he wants that fighter to continue to win, right? And the person who's going to ensure that that happens is someone on staff for the promoter called the matchmaker. And there's a true art to being an effective matchmaker. It takes years of experience in the boxing game to become really competent as a matchmaker. But let's just go over like a couple of principles here. Quite often the matchmaker is given an overall budget for that fight card. That promoter doesn't want to get involved with minutia. He just says, hey, you got to match, these 6 of my fighters. Just fill up the card. Here's your overall budget. Let me know when you got it done. And he doesn't care, or he cares, but he doesn't want to get too involved in all these little minutia details. And some of those details include what we call the B side. The promoter's fighter's the A side. Everybody that the matchmaker matches the A side with is called the B side. They are the opponents. Now, this doesn't happen with the UFC because they're an in-house deal. 99.9% of all fights made that you see on a UFC card are both 2 UFC fighters. Every now and again, on a rare occasion, a fight falls apart at the last minute. They'll find maybe a local MMA fighter to jump in kind of last minute, but that doesn't really happen very often, if at all. So back to boxing. This is standard for boxing, though. So we have what we call the A side. That's the promoter's fighters, and the B side. Now, typically when it's fight night, all the A-side fighters are either in the red corner or they're all in the blue corner. So this makes it pretty hard to mess up or to be for the judges. I mean, as soon as someone hands them the bout sheet, which is a list of all the fights in order from preliminary fights through to the main event, that boxing judge should know which side of that sheet is supposed to win every fight. So again, the boxing judges know who's cutting their paycheck or paying for their wages at the end of the night. They know which fighters are, in quote, supposed to win, so it's not hard to figure out. If it's a close round, give it to the in-house fighter, give it to the A-side fighter, right? This is just called job security. It's not corruption per se, right? Promoters are tight-fisted with the money. As a general rule, they're super tight-fisted. So they're not going to pay for anything they don't need to pay for. And that includes they're not going to pay off a judge when the understanding is, oh, you want to continue to get work as a boxing judge? Well, for me, well then, we want to see our guys win whenever it's a close fight. The promoter wants to see his fighter win the fight. Now, obviously, there's some cases where you just can't, and if it doesn't go to decision, it's always possible for the B-side fighter to pull the upset, but it's not likely that they would pull the upset via a decision. They're going to need to pull the upset via a TKO or a KO, or, maybe the A-side somehow manages to DQ themselves. But in any case, my point here is it's pretty crystal clear to the judge what his mission is for the evening. Nobody really has to explain it to them. Hey, these are the guys that need to win. It's like they should have already figured that out before they even parked at the venue. So now there is sort of another half to this piece that may not be obvious, and that's how the matchmaker picks those B-side opponents. Now, typically, of course, the mission is for the promoter's fighter, the A-side guy or girl, to win. But they can't just blow out somebody, who can't even fight. That's why there's a certain art to being a good matchmaker, because you got to pick an opponent who is viable, meaning first of all, they can't be on any suspension from any commission anywhere, meaning, like, let's say their last fight they got KO'd just 3 weeks ago. Well, it's not likely that they're going to be allowed to fight within a month or 2 months of that time. Second thing, you're going to need to make sure that potential opponent can pass all their medical exams prior to getting the license. Third, here's something that a lot of matchmakers will do is they don't actually contact the potential opponent till very short notice, which would mean a month or less, quite often just 2 weeks, sometimes even the week of the fight, especially if a fight falls apart at the last minute. So what they'll do, or the reason they do this, is because they want that fighter, the potential opponent, to come in fighting at a weight division above what they would optimally fight at, because they don't really have time to make weight. The matchmaker also doesn't want to give that opponent time to have a full camp and prepare for his or the promoter's fighter. So they time this so this opponent probably is not signed to another promoter. They don't have a lot of opportunities to fight. So it's kind of like, hey, do you want this chance? You'll earn a few dollars and you have the chance to pull the upset, and you also get some fight experience. So that's sort of the incentive for the opponent to take the fight. But now let's say that opponent accepts this fight. The thing is, I should back up a little bit. The other two things that the matchmaker has to consider is they want that opponent to be beatable by their fighter, but they can't be a complete blowout. They've got to make it look like a good fight, right? And still be beatable. So that's kind of a fine line. The other thing to consider is that, and this is where the real art of matchmaking comes into play, you want to build the promoter's fighter. That means they can't just build the record and get to 20-0. They need to be learning every time they fight. So that opponent needs to be a little test for that promoter's fighter, and the promoter's fighter needs to pass the test every single fight, right? But there should be a little bit of a challenge to push that fighter to bring out the best in that fighter, have them step up to the plate and slowly move themselves up the ladder, skill set wise and ring smart wise and all of that. So it's no easy task being a good boxing matchmaker. But now let's say they've identified that perfect opponent, offered them the fight, negotiated the purse, contracts are signed. Now, here's where sort of the shenanigans can begin, depending on the promoter and depending on the matchmaker. Because again, matchmaker's job is to give every advantage to their fighter and none of the extra advantages to the opponent. So how do we do this? Well, we also want to save as much money or spend as little money as possible. So we've got to take into considerations transportation, accommodation, and food for this opponent and their one other person, which is their trainer. Well, you guys know inexpensive flights mean layovers, connections, all of that, which is obviously very draining. And less expensive accommodations, well, you know, we're talking like Motel 6. We're not talking 5-star hotels or anything like that. And then of course, meal wise, well, you know, typically you just give them a certain daily a per diem and try to get it. The matchmaker is going to try to be as cheap as possible with the per diem. So point there being, quite often you'll bring in the opponent. They'll have endured a long flight with a bunch of connections. Maybe they're not staying in the nicest of hotels, sort of bare minimum, 2 steps above a Roach Motel or something. But the point is there, you know, just don't make the opponent feel super comfortable. And on the other hand, you're going to treat your fighter, your in-house fighter, you're going to treat him like the prize pig, right? Like, give them sort of luxury transportation into the fight city, put them up in a very nice hotel, great meals, limo to the venue, all of the above. And so my point here is that by the time that opponent walks up the stairs to enter the ring, you want them to be a little bit more drained than your fighter, or a little bit more, like, not quite as up as your fighter who's been treated so well. They're you know, their spirits high and all of that. So again, my point here is it's not so-called rocket science. You know, the opponent's being brought in to lose, so we're not giving him any kind of advantage whatsoever. And this is how the screenplay is supposed to play out, right? The promoter's A-side fighter is supposed to get the W and look good doing so. So bottom line is, we don't need to pay off any judges. They know who's supposed to win. So if there's a close round, they're going to give the 10 to the promoter's fighter and the 9 to the opponent. So I would argue it's not about corruption per se. You know, if you want to somehow change that whole structure, you know, I'm not sure how you do that. I mean, do you you would have to get every commission everywhere to change the rules and say, hey, promoters, we're just going to blindly choose the judges and you have no say in who these judges are. But then again, you know, in the end, honestly, I think what it comes down to is education. So I would say there's really not corrupt judges as such, as much as there probably are some very ignorant judges. And that would go for both the boxing world and the MMA world. But judging in MMA, that's a whole different kettle of fish, and that deserves its is deserving of its own video. So we'll save that for another time. But what do you think about boxing judging in general, especially those of you who've been watching boxing fights over the years? Have you noticed a shift in how judges judge a fight? What do you think we need to do, if anything? Is there a remedy to ensure better or more fair judging? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for listening.